Hello, everyone. Welcome back. We are still at the International Conference for Global Citizenship Education, and this is the first plenary session of today, or our second plenary session of the whole conference. Now, we have just heard from three different concurrent sessions. And of course, life is not fair, and you had to choose just one. So you were either at the policy and advocacy concurrent session, or you were at the curriculum session, or you were at the monitoring session. Well, I have great news for you. This session is a wrap-up session. So what we're going to do for the next hour is that we are going to hear from each one of the three monitors from the concurrent sessions. They are going to provide us with the main key points from their sessions. And afterwards, we are going to hear from two discussants that I will introduce in due time. And then we will have a time to chat and to talk and to maybe arrive at some recommendations for action, or just how do we put all this information together? Where do we go from here? So please be very aware that the chat box is open and that we also want to hear your comments and your questions. So let's get ready to start. Now, of course, you already know our panelists. They have been presenting the concurrent sessions, and they have been also in other panels from yesterday. But I am going to briefly introduce them again in the order that they are going to present their remarks. So we will first hear from Neil Suwin, who is a professor of the School of Education, Culture and Society from Monash University in Australia, and he will present about the concurrent session on policy and advocacy. Then we will hear from Shama Bulangis, who is the co-chair for Transfer Education, hosted by UNGE Philippines, who was the monitor for the Curriculum, Pedagogy and Practice concurrent session. And then we will hear from Esther Kerr, Professional Fellow from Melbourne Graduate School of Education, the University of Melbourne. And she will be talking about the concurrent session on monitoring. And later on, I will properly introduce Caroline Wilson and also Antonia Wolf, who are joining us online, and they will be the discussants of today's ideas. So let's get right to it. Neil, why don't you start speaking to us about your concurrent session? What were the main key points?
Certainly. So thanks very much for that, Lisa. I was the moderator for the policy and advocacy session. We had a huge discussion, so it's very wide-ranging and very rambling. So these dot points are in no particular order, but hopefully they will scaffold our conversation to come. So hopefully the dot points can be put up on the screen, but cunningly I have them on a piece of paper as well. The first key issues and challenges that we talked about was the fact that digital technology and global citizenship issues are changing all the time. So this is an area that's fast changing, and there's a need for flexibility. There's no just one solution that can be kind of manufactured and then that will do us right for the next 10 years. We need to continually be changing and innovating. The issue of digital divides, plural, came up again and again, and particularly stressing the point that this isn't to do with the kind of the quantity of technology and getting technology into people's hands, but it's the quality of the education that results, and that there is a big gap still in quality education, even when we've solved basic access issues. As you might expect, teachers and lack of investment in teachers came up again and again. Teachers have a lack of time to deal with these issues. There's a lack of curriculum space for them to actually kind of do these issues. There's a need for ongoing professional learning and teacher education. It came up again and again that there seems to be a sense that there's a generation gap between teachers and younger generations that are digital natives. I push back on that because I don't agree with that whatsoever, which is why there's a question mark there. But people were quite kind of keen to discuss this idea of there being a generational issue. But also this idea that teachers need to be comfortable digitally as opposed to just competent. So this idea that teachers need to inhabit digital environments and be digital themselves in order to be really successful GCED educators. One really important point that came through was that GECD tends to avoid telling hard stories and being critical about digital technology. There's a sense of digital technology as a positive thing. Context clearly matters. One size doesn't fit all. And this came up when we talked about digital technology as a topic from, say, a sub-Saharan African point of view, which is where a lot of the rare minerals and kind of exploitation of low-paid workers actually fuels the technologies that we use. So when we talk about digital technology in that context, we're telling very different stories than we would from, say, the global north. And also the point that we don't tend to share our digital expertise. During the pandemic, we were sharing vaccine expertise. We weren't sharing digital expertise in terms of educating online. So those key issues and challenges were kind of juxtaposed with some really good case studies that I do recommend you watch on the videos if you weren't part of our session. Our representative from CMEO talked about a high-level forum where they bring together 11 different nations and 11 different ministries of education to develop common approaches to digital global citizenship education, and particularly in terms of resources and sharing best practices. So they're running a really successful series of MOOCs, for example, to get educators from the 11 regions to actually work alongside each other and also to share their resources. So OERs were a particularly useful approach there. From Bangladesh, we heard about the 10-minute school that was developed during the COVID pandemic. Key here is fitting digital education to broader digital cultures. Students had 10 minutes between doing something online and then flicking to Facebook. And the idea was, instead of them going to, say, Twitter or TikTok, they could go to the 10-minute school. So the school was based around digital temporalities, digital rhythms, and digital practices. A lot of our presenters focus primarily on schools and teachers as the place to really tackle digital issues. And I was, again, trying to push back, saying, surely it's not just about schools, but schools are clearly a key site that we need to work on. And our representative from Beirut gave us some really good examples about how schools could be used, particularly using creative digital practices, digital creation, digital arts, creating videos, creating art space, creating music, as a way of actually kind of working through ideas and bringing artists and the community into schools to tackle some really interesting issues. So in terms of our recommendations then, we had a few tangible things that we would recommend. Moving on to slide number 3. None of this happens unless we pay for it. The finance and investment in infrastructure is key, and this is devices, resources, and workforce. And we had a really interesting discussion about how public-private partnerships, bringing the for-profit corporate money in alongside government money is one way forward, but also how there are targeted and tailored financial approaches that are embedded into some UN systems and UN mechanisms to fund GCED. We should be using these to fund digital GCED. As I said, all 4 presenters were adamant that schools are a key place for digital CED to take place. Schools are embedded in local communities and wider society, so they should engage with families, so they should engage with local communities, but they do remain a key space where students and young people can do digital things differently. All of this is a workforce issue. Teachers need time and space to engage effectively with this and develop everything I've just talked about. So there's certainly a union issue here that I hope Antonia will pick up. Teacher training and teacher education is very easy to talk about, very difficult to do in practice. And in particular, we talked about universities and initial teacher education as being one way forward, as well as using digital resources to openly share best practice. The idea of best practices may be a little bit homogenizing, so perhaps we should say interesting practices, because one size doesn't fit all. So we want to push back against this idea about there being a best practice or a good practice. But certainly sharing these is really important. Critical digital education, using GCED as a space to be critical and develop critically aware citizens, and bringing in philosophy of technology and AI ethics is really important. And last of all, encouraging youth advocacy through creative digital practice. A lot there to chew on.
Thank you so much, Neil. And I'm going back to you again because I would like to ask you to end up with a question. I'm sorry I didn't say this before, but I would like if all our panelists or our moderators from the concurrent sessions to end their participations posing a question that maybe we can reference to later from other panelists, or even you, if you are listening to us, wherever you are, you can also pose your questions for our discussion later on. So please give us a question.
So global citizenship education in the digital age is a huge task. It can't just be put onto teachers and schools. What other actors need to be involved, and how do we get them involved? We've got big corporations, we've got teaching unions, we've got all sorts of other actors in this space. How can these actors work together, and how can we actually kind of work together to make a real positive change to digital citizenship?
Huge question. Well, let's think about it. And meanwhile, why don't we go to you now, Shanna? So can you present what were the main points in your session? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Elisa. And I'm going to try my best to fully cover everything that was also in the session. I don't know if it's going to be shown already, the first slide, so I'll just have my phone here just in case as well. Thank you, Neil, for the idea. So for key issues and challenges, thank you. For key issues and challenges, we've put it together on two categories. First is tension points, and the second one is the actual challenges that that are being faced on the ground. So there's two main tension points that was discussed during the conversations that we've had in terms of delivering the curriculum and the pedagogical strategies. The first one is urgency versus recovery. There needs to be a sense of urgency, especially in addressing misinformation, for example, and in the digital age. But also at the same time, we need to make sure that we are also able to slow down and make sure that we understand that people are still recovering. Teachers are also still recovering. We're always expecting teachers to solve everything all at once, especially during crisis situations. So there needs to be a balance, and it's not necessarily addressed in the sessions, but this is a point that that came across during the conversations. The second one is, on the tension points, is that we currently have individualized platforms, but there is definitely a need for community building, and that was one of the challenges that those that have created these online platforms, from the case studies that I will present later, have tried to navigate as well, how to still do community building while we are in platforms that have been created to be highly individualized as well. The challenges, of course, and I think these are pretty much self-explanatory for everybody. It's number one, the understanding of the digital grammar of youth, especially if you're trying to make the best out of user experience for young people to be able to use these platforms, for teachers to be able to use the platforms. And I'm going to talk about a case study as well in developing this later. But key to that is being able to understand the digital grammar of youth, and continuously doing that process. It's an iterative, I don't know if that's how you explain it, if that's how you say it, understanding of the digital grammar of youth. The second challenge is distraction. There's a lot of competition around there on MOOCs, for example. There's so much competition around there. How do you pull focus to the content? How do you pull focus from TikTok, from social media? There's so much distraction everywhere, and that's something that also is something that teachers are navigating. Another key issue that we've mentioned, and this is very much related to the digital divide, is connectivity, whether it's the lack of connectivity or the quality of that connectivity. So even if you have connection to the internet, it's poor connection. Whenever it rains, somehow your internet connection just lags. Then navigating the pandemic as well. This is a big thing that came up in all of the presenters. And then last but not the least is that GCED is not always reflected in the curriculum in the current status quo that we have, especially in the case that I'm going to present now. Please, next slide. In the Philippines. The next slide, I don't know. Okay, so these are the good practice cases that have been mentioned in the conversations, and I know I only have 2 minutes, so I'm going to try my best to keep up. But the first one is from Dylan. They have this platform called Symphony, and it tries to limit the distraction. So the content was created with a lot of partners, because understanding that we do not have the monopoly over knowledge, but also at the same time, their platform itself tries to limit distraction, tries to make young people stop and reflect, because in the online world, it's always this. It's very bite-sized. It's always like we you need to go from one content to another. It's making young people stop and think. That's the challenge. And they're trying to do that in their platform as well and in their surroundings. And then there's another one which is called Video for Change, which is trying to capture emotion through videos and giving a voice to young people to be able to giving a voice, or actually we already have a voice, amplifying our voice through the use of videos and shareable videos to be able to raise awareness and build empathy. For AppCU Curriculum Development and Integration Project in the Philippines, the idea of, I'm so sorry, the idea of being able to integrate it is so that teachers won't be so overburdened with additional curriculums in the process. So they contextualize it, they localize the GCED indicators in the Philippine context, they developed a manual and guidelines for teachers to integrate GCED in their lessons, and they've established a monitoring and evaluation mechanism for that as well. In AppCU and their capacity building program, this is especially with young people and also their alumni as well, they've developed a new model for capacity building programs, which is open to anyone. It's participatory, it's engaging, and it's interactive. There's self-paced learning, there's a main workshop, there's a mentorship and competition, and afterwards, they're going to be able to apply that, whatever they have learned from the first 3 phases into their project implementation, but also have mentorship along the way as they implement their projects. Hopefully, I know I'm lost for time, but let's go to the key recommendations. And these are just very high level. Again, please look at the video so that you're able to like get the nitty gritty of the recommendations. But number one is, because we've talked about misinformation, there needs to be teacher training on addressing misinformation, on activating intellectual, personal, and emotional aspects of learning for both learners and educators, because the focus has always been learners, and we need to also do that for educators. The urgency of activating teachers, especially, again, this is on misinformation. Humanizing the digital environment, creating a platform where learners, educators, students, and teachers are all co-creators in the content, and especially in how this content is organized, and also strengthening partnerships with governments and other stakeholders to be able to deliver the type of localization and the contextualization, because without these partners, it won't be a completely consultative and collaborative environment for GCED. So thank you so much. I'm so sorry for overextending my time. Back to you, Lisa.
Well, it was really a very rich session. So you did a wonderful work of putting everything in just a few minutes. But you're not free to go yet. I need your question.
Oh, right. So one of the main questions that we actually had after reflecting on our session is that, what are some of the ways, and I think this may be something that people can answer as well, what are some of the ways that we are able to transfer the current face-to-face pedagogical strategies that we have online? We've talked about community building online, we've talked about like being able to, transfer content online, but how do we transfer the strategies, pedagogical strategies online? That would be my question.
Well, that's a huge question. So please think about it and share your comments on the chat box. Meanwhile, Esther, now we are ready for you. Please share with us, what were the key points? What is your summary of your session, which was monitoring?
That's right, it was monitoring. And so I'm going to just very quickly talk about what each presentation was before I go on to key challenges and so on. We went from the overarching global to international to regional to local, when we looked at different approaches to monitoring. And so first of all, we looked at the UIS, UNESCO Institute of Statistics approach with monitoring of SDG. Then we went through from that looking at the global indicator for 4.7, 4.7.1, looking then to thematic indicators, to 3 other ones, and I'll come back to that in a moment. We then, if we think about what the sort of bird's eye view there was, we're looking at it overarching. Where do we go to find a grounded level to understand what's happening in classrooms? Then we went to the international level and we picked up on the IEA perspective with Ralph Karsten, because IEA actually provides a lot of the data that is contributing to SDG monitoring. And so Ralph drew attention to the political and social contexts in which we collect information. And of course, IEA has two major programs that can contribute to global citizenship monitoring. From there, we went to a regional perspective. And so we heard from Rachel Parker from ACER, where she talked about CPLM, Southeast Asian Primary Learning Metrics, which was referred to earlier, but it's a regional international assessment large-scale program where they've picked up on literacy and numeracy as well as global citizenship. And so one of the issues here is we're starting to get to more grounded levels, thinking about what are teachers' perceptions, what's happening on the ground. And from there we went to local. And so at local, we looked at what is happening here in Korea and at some work that has been done to look at a national framework for global citizenship education, looking at tools that can capture capacity of teachers and whether that's a useful way to go in terms of building teacher competencies. So that gives you just a very, very quick description of the 4 sessions that we had. And so from that, we've picked up on key challenges and we've picked up on strengths and we've picked up on where to go next. And on this slide now that you can see very quick pulling together of all of the information. And I'm not going to read through it all, of course. I just want to highlight a few of these points for us to think about as we go on. So the first one that we got from UIS, there's primarily a reliance on cognitive information for monitoring of the SDGs at the moment. And we know that this is a problem with GCED generally. We've got cognitive, we've got social emotional, we've got behavioural competencies, and what we can most easily pick up on is the cognitive. So what does that mean for where else we go? So a big issue there. Then we looked at IEA. What is a key challenge there? What to focus on? Because they have a number of resources, multiple resources. Where do you go to pick up what is absolutely essential for us to understand what's happening at the international level for those countries that engage in international large-scale assessment? Then we go to the regional level with CPLM again and looking at what are the key indicators for teachers. How do we know that they're competent? How do they know that they're competent? And in fact, the Korean presentation picked up on that exactly the same way, that it's one thing for teachers to say they're self-confident, that they have self-efficacy, but do they? When they walk in the classroom, what do they do? Where do they go? And we saw a very, very similar sort of pattern with 21st century skills with the work out of UNESCO Bangkok some years ago. So that's key challenges. Then when we move on to good practices, we can look fairly quickly at this. It seems unfair to look at the good practices very quickly, but what we have here is very clear definitions and focus at the UIS level, at the overarching level. From IEA, we have this ability to sample data from so many different perspectives, so we get breadth. If we look at the regional level, we pick up on this very clear focus on the teacher and the student. And so you notice here that as we have that progression from the overarching global down to the local, we start to become more and more specific and more grounded. And when we get down to the career level, we have this incredibly analytic approach to thinking about what is the policy and how is that going to support where we move on next. Then if we look at where do we go next? Where do we go next? Both the first two presentations, the global and the international, really are talking about maybe we look at something like 4.7.6 where we can focus on what is happening in the ground. What are the enabling factors? If we think about planned, implemented curriculum, what's happening in terms of what the environment is, what the teachers can do, and what the students actually receive. And so we heard a very similar key message from both of those presentations. Then when we look at CPLM, we start looking at what are the tools that we can use in the classroom, and then we can move from those tools to think about how do we make a link between what we find in the classroom and how that leads to an overall perspective about moving along. I'm very quickly going to draw our attention before I finish to this issue of digitisation. We've been talking about transformation in education and digital transformation, and we need to think about that not only in terms of the educational classroom, we need to think about it in terms of monitoring. So there are two aspects here to the digitisation. Is it happening in the classroom? Is it happening in monitoring? They're two very different questions. So if we think about education delivery, and this goes back to what you just spoke about, what are the implications for digital transformation for teaching and learning? We have students across the world in very, very different situations. Some are together, some are not. Some have appliances, some do not. Where do we go with this? That's the first big issue. Then when we look at digitisation in the field of monitoring, what are the implications of digitisation for global monitoring? We can see here, this is a shot from the 4.7.6 pilot, and one of the countries that participated in that was the Gambia. This is how they did the monitoring. Absolutely no digitisation. So we need to be thinking about what does that imply for capture of data worldwide, and we need to think even more carefully about, is there a digital transformation? So very interesting to hear from Sharma about the excitement that can be generated from our thinking about what's happening in the field of education. But we know that in many countries in the world, that is not happening. It's not that there is minimal digitalisation, it's almost that there is none in some. So how do we deal with these issues as we move forward? And for my question...
Yes. I think you're basically profiling your questions, but yes.
I am. My main question is, are the global criteria that we use to define GCED, are they meaningful in a local environment? Where do we take that? The fact that we do have regional and local initiatives seems to me to be saying we're not going to rely purely on the global. We do need to think about the local and how do we equip the local to pick up data that's useful to them for the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Esther. Well, now we have 3 very specific questions. Please think about them. Please share your thoughts in the chat box and also share your own questions, because when we are done with the presentations, then it will be time for us to get to the questions and to chat about everything that we have been learning so far in these 2 days. Well, now I said at the beginning of this session that we have 2 people joining us online, and now is the time to properly introduce them. So we have Caroline Wilson, who is the Executive Director of the McLuhan Foundation. She's also a lecturer, Faculty of Education of the University of Western Ontario in Canada, and former chair of the UNESCO Mill Alliance, and she's joining us online. And we also have Antonia Wolf, who is the Director of Research, Policy and Advocacy at Education International, which is the World Federation of Teacher Units representing teacher unions, representing 32 million teachers and education support personnel in 178 countries. Now, both Antonia and Caroline are joining us online, and they are going to give us their remarks, their first impressions of these 3 summaries from our concurrent sessions. So I believe that we have Caroline ready for us. Caroline, can you please share your thoughts on what you have just heard about our concurrent sessions? Welcome.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be joining you from Canada this very early morning for me, but definitely worth it. What a fantastic experience you must be having there together, and obviously you'll have virtual participation as well, but really impressed by the comments and the discussion that you're sharing. So where to begin? There's just a wealth of ideas, and obviously really valuable debates and explorations have taken place. I'll share just a few ideas from a particular perspective and welcome the opportunity to explore all of this a bit further when we come together after Antonio and I have shared a few comments. I'm really struck, first of all, by the efforts and the attention paid to really examining what global citizenship education means today, what it needs to mean, what it needs to include, not only for the benefit of students, but for teachers as well. I was really struck by a couple of comments, and really all three of our speakers made these in various ways, but there is clearly an emphasis on the need for developing or encouraging the development of critically aware citizens. And there are a number of ways, of course, that can be taken up. One of the things that struck me, though, was the place of digital technology in all of this. And obviously, access is an important and a major issue across the world today. But I would like to argue that access needs to be coupled with media literacy education or digital literacy education, that access to technology isn't enough, but that our teachers and students need opportunities to develop critical thinking about how the media operate, how they construct meaning, how they can be used, and how to evaluate the information that they present. So access in and of itself isn't a complete picture. I think we really need to argue and push for a media literacy or a digital literacy component. In Ontario, Canada, where I work, media literacy is mandated in grade 1 through grade 12, and it's often a standalone course at the secondary level as well. Excuse me. Ontario was the first English-speaking jurisdiction in the world to mandate media literacy education in schools. So it has had a significant impact, not only in Canada, but in other parts of the world through various collaborations. But I would say also that like several of our presenters mentioned, a great need still exists in teacher education. So we have been paying attention to curriculum and policy and where that can benefit students. But I guess, you know, a gentle criticism of things as they have evolved here and in other parts of the world is that we have not offered the same support to teachers. So that ongoing discussion that was mentioned about professional development, ongoing professional development for in-service teachers, a teacher education investment, partnerships that might serve that. I think those are all really core issues that we need to explore. Another thing that Shama and Esther and Neil, that all of you raised, really had to do with the development of competencies as well, not only for students, but for teachers. And I guess, you know, in terms of moving forward and looking at future development then, what are some of the things that we could prioritize? Certainly developing a kind of critical framework for curriculum and also for the development of competencies would be useful. And I'm thinking of this in terms of bringing what might be seen as traditional global citizenship education together with a media literacy perspective. I would also like to just recommend a couple of resources. Media Smarts in Canada has developed a series of competencies, a digital literacy framework that might be useful, where they talk about access, use, understanding, and creation of digital media products. But I guess the larger issue that I want to raise, and again, all of you have hinted at this, is the need really for collaboration. Excuse me, for collaboration and sharing of practices, of approaches, and really, I think this provides us with an opportunity to build bridges between disciplines and to come together and to share our learning across the world. And in that regard, I would like to invite you to the Global Village Square for Digital Media Literacy, which is a project that has been launched by the McLuhan Foundation, of which I am the executive director. it's an online space for collaboration, community building, and sharing news, events, practices, success stories, and challenges. And that's the Global Village Square. I can speak more about that later, but you can certainly find that wonderful space online. Obviously a nod to Marshall McLuhan in the title, the fact that we're all part of this digital global village now. You can find that certainly if you visit the website for the McLuhan Foundation. Thank you very much. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Caroline. Will it be too much to ask if you can also pose a question? Can you think about a question that you would like to leave on the floor? Are you still there?
I am. I'm
Okay.
still here, and I'm thinking about that opportunity. Well, I guess for me, a question would be, what are some strategies that we can identify for coming together, for perhaps bridging disciplines, for encouraging that collaboration and learning from practices that have been demonstrated in various fields that now really have come together because of this digital world, because of the global village.
Thank you so much, Caroline. Well, we are ready now to go to Antonia Wolf, who will also present her remarks regarding what she just heard about our 3 concurrent sessions. Antonia, are you there? We're ready for you.
I am. Thank you so much, Elisa, and a warm hello to you all from Brussels, where I'm based. So I'm going to bring you a couple of reflections from our members. That means teachers across the globe, from early childhood through to higher education. And I wanted to start with a piece of research that our members in Sweden did only about 3-4 months into the pandemic. And this was research that aimed to look at how the working conditions and professional practice of teachers had changed as teaching and learning was shifting online. And a shocking 60% of the Swedish teachers responding to this survey reported that they thought it was harder to meet learning objectives when teaching online. And the piece that I really wanted to draw your attention to was that more than 90% of these respondents said that they felt that it was more difficult to meet learning objectives related to the non-cognitive learning objectives. Some of them talked about these being social objectives. Many talked about these being the things that really makes teaching a rewarding profession. So there was a kind of reflection linked to this observation around how they feared that shifting teaching and learning online would actually contribute to making teaching less rewarding as a profession. But it does give reason to pause, to have more than 90% conclude that it's harder to engage in teaching and learning around non-cognitive areas of the curriculum, the broader purpose of education, and the values that are very much at the heart of global citizenship education. We also, EI recently did a research with UNESCO called Teachers Have Their Say, looking at teachers' readiness to teach global citizenship education. There we had quite a stunning lack of support, lack of training. So while more than 90% of those responding thought that it was important or very important to teach cultural diversity, for instance, only a third felt that they were able to explain the history of racism. We had a quarter of teachers say that they were able to explain how to speak up against discrimination. That means 3/4 of teachers felt that they did not know how to even engage in a conversation around how we speak up and challenge discrimination. One quarter of respondents also reported that they were not familiar with suitable pedagogies for teaching cultural diversity. So there's a massive piece around training, initial teacher training, but also continuous professional development, really responding to the needs of teachers in the classroom. Here, I think there's a massive challenge for us, finding ways of ensuring that the continuous professional development that is offered to teachers is actually needs-based. So decisions made around professional development should be made with teachers, with their representative unions, to really ensure that it supports them in what they are trying to do. There's also research showing that teachers seldom have a say on the digital tools and platforms that are used in education. I think this is something for us to look at. Here's also a fundamental link to privacy protection. Human Rights Watch recently put out research looking at children's personal data and the very, very large number of edtech products that directly sell or grant access to children's personal data. So here's a big issue around both students and teachers' privacy and how we can ensure that that's protected. My last point is about professional autonomy. And this may actually be my main point, because we all know that a quality education is dependent on the professional autonomy of trained and qualified teachers. Yet we are seeing massive assaults on the professional autonomy of teachers, and this is across the globe. So the question is really, how do we safeguard teachers' rights to choose what to teach, how to teach, the right of academics to choose what they do research on, and how they present it, what materials a teacher in the classroom wishes to draw upon as she is engaging in global citizenship education. And here's an interesting question. Maybe our understanding of professional autonomy needs to also start including digital tools and platforms in this definition of what teachers should be able to choose themselves. So if we think of a quality education as somehow based on a freedom of inquiry, we're faced with a massive challenge related to education systems that are increasingly geared towards different forms of standardized tests, many of which are high stakes, reducing the space, the time for global citizenship education, and all of those other things that just emerge in a classroom as teachers and students are engaging in that freedom of inquiry, looking into all these things that are happening around them, trying to understand why society is looking the way it does. And here, and this is my final point, here there really is something to be said around making sure that schools, education institutions have that space to also look into facts that are inconvenient to those in power, facts that are difficult for all of us to grapple with, facts that require an active stance, and actually, probably down the line, some very, very active citizenship. Then America came out in August showing that there had been a 250% increase in state legislative proposals aimed to restrict the freedom to teach and learn. This was PEN America, so the state legislation we're talking about is all in the US. However, a 250% increase in the legislation aiming to restrict what can be taught, which books we can use, should all give us pause. Of course, in the US, this is much about US history. It's about race relations. It's about LGBTIQ+. But fundamentally, it's about all of us. It's about climate change, fossil fuel industries, and their impact on what's taught in our classrooms. So the question that I would really leave you with is, how do we come together to protect that professional autonomy of teachers and that freedom of inquiry in our classrooms, in our lecture halls, because that is really the heart of quality education, the heart of citizenship education. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Antonia. Well, we have now wonderful questions for us to ponder. And I hope that all these interventions have awakened your curiosity. Remember that you can revisit the sessions, the concurrent sessions, the ones that you attended, but also the other 2 ones that you did not attend. They are still online, and you can go over and just take a look for yourself of everything that has been said here. Now, we have a very limited time to go on a final round with all our speakers. I hope that we have also some questions from you, from the people that are listening to us. If we have, maybe it's the time to share them so we can decide which ones we can tackle. So for the last intervention of each of our speakers, I will propose that you decide which question that was proposed you want to answer, or maybe you want to go in a different direction and just comment on something that you heard. So I am going to revisit the questions that were shared. Of course, we start with Neil. He said, what are the other stakeholders in global citizenship education? How do we bring them together? What are the expectations that are realistic for us to have about them? Shaman asks us to think about how to go from face-to-face pedagogy to online pedagogy. I like this question very much because it's not just content distribution, the role of technology, but how do we translate pedagogy into the digital world? Esther asks us about if global criteria is meaningful on the global scale, but also on the individual or local scale. Can we apply the same rules everywhere? And she even hints of an answer when she was asking that question. Then we have Antonia and Caroline. Caroline asks about strategies for coming together and collaborating. And Antonia is asking, how do we safeguard teachers' right, teachers' freedom about what to teach and how to teach it? And I would like to pose a question myself, if I am able to do so, about everything that we have been talking about. Something that I feel it's coming up is curriculum overload and how so many things are expected from teachers. And teachers are not superheroes. We like to think that we are, but we're not. We are real flesh and blood human people, and sometimes it's just too much. So how do we go from there? How do we make an impact with our limited resources? So let's start again with you, Neil, and each one of you has just 2 minutes. Let's be very great with our timing because, yeah, it's flying. So 2 minutes or even 1 minute will be even better. Neil.
So this is a really tricky topic. I think there's at least 3 different conversations going on. The first of all is digitization of global citizenship education. So teaching using technology, that's one discussion. Then there's the digital as a topic of global citizenship education and how we need to be critical about it. And then there's digitization of monitoring. So I think there are 3 strands going on, so we need to be careful about not kind of crossing them. I think very briefly in terms of Sharma's question, digital pedagogy is very, very different to face-to-face pedagogy. You don't just translate traditional pedagogy online. There's a complete literature around how we teach online, and it's very, very, very different. So I think that's an interesting thing to think about there. The place where I think we can come together perhaps to discuss these things in an interdisciplinary way are topics like AI ethics. And in universities, for example, bringing STEM and HAS together to discuss these things is really important. And having STEM graduates that have a HAS background and HAS graduates that have STEM expertise is really, really interesting. So something to talk about there. And finally, in terms of the discussions around how do we teacher and student autonomy, digital creativity, I think, is really, really interesting. Using digital tools to create things is a really interesting way of being critical about them. So I think in terms of global citizenship, the freedom of inquiry and the freedom of thought can perhaps be found in using digital tools to support young people to create things. And just very, very finally, I'm not a teacher. I'm not interested in teachers, so I don't want to become too teacher-centric. We need to talk about young people. We need to talk about corporate, non-profits. There's a whole bunch of other things, I think. It's not just about loading everything onto teachers, for better or for worse.
Great job. In time. Shama, we got to you.
Thank you so much. No, I just wanted to comment on what Antonia said, especially on like curriculum and what teachers can teach as well. That's very close to my heart because especially on comprehensive sexuality education, a lot of teachers are uncomfortable in teaching about it as well. But there are teachers who want to teach about it, but then are not allowed to teach because it's not in the modules at all. And I think that that's something that I don't currently have an answer for, but I think that's something that we definitely are also pushing for, especially from member states to be able to like transfer that to their technical and the departments of education or the ministries of education as well. To answer Carolyn's question on collaboration, me as a member and a leader in a Young Feminist Coalition, we're all about collaboration. We actually are currently doing a research on like how to do intergenerational partnerships and have good practices around intergenerational partnerships. And I can just offer that as well as an answer. It's not completely out there yet, but one of the ways that we're able that we want to be able to do it is that we have existing intergenerational partnerships, but it needs to be equal. Like everybody has to have a decision-making powers within these partnerships. Everybody needs to have all of the information. Everybody needs to have all of the agency so for it to be a completely collaborative process.
Okay, great. Esther.
Thank you. I'm wanting to bring together 2 points. One of them yours, Elisa, about teacher overload, and the other picking up on Caroline and talking, she asked about the different strategies that we might need to bring so that we can work together. And for me, this comes to the issue of where does global citizenship sit in a school? And as soon as we have started bringing in different aspects of education going toward 21st century skills or global citizenship, we've moved away from a discipline-centric approach to curriculum. So this is not talking about history and maths and science. It's talking about an approach to education where our focus is on the whole person, for lack of a better phrase. Who teaches the whole person? Which teacher is responsible for that? Is that the mathematician? Is that the teacher of history? Is that the teacher of language? No. So we have a whole education system and a whole system of faculties that is based on disciplines. And until we find a way of integrating concepts such as global citizenship across those faculties, until we help teachers to discover how they integrate these concepts within their discipline-specific content, we're not going to get anywhere. At the moment, there's no one teacher who is responsible for teaching global citizenship, and indeed we would not want that, because it touches every aspect of life. Whether we think, as Antonio was talking about, climate control or anything else, we need to be understanding the social, the political, the geographic, the scientific aspects of that, and we need to build global citizenship within all of those. So we need to start thinking about how do we reorganise our school system and our curriculum in a way that it does empower the teachers to pick up on concepts like this? And how do we equip them to do that in terms of teaching in the social emotional areas and thinking about the behavioural outcomes.
Esther, your comment just brought me this idea about what the OECD presented in the results from the Global Citizenship evaluation in 2018. And the countries that had the best results were the ones that were integrating global citizenship into the curriculum. So thank you for that. Thank you so much for that. Caroline, your intervention. You choose which question or what you want to comment. You have 2 minutes.
Thank you very much. I'm inspired by the discussion and people's comments and what you shared as well, Antonia. I'd just like to share a few thoughts, if I could, really about the impact of technologies. We know that digital technology today has the power to influence us regardless of content or even intended purpose, right? That technologies really can shape and do shape. Certainly we've learned this during the pandemic, if not prior to that. They have the power to shape all of our communications, our associations, and our behaviors. And when we think about it, virtually as citizens, as global citizens today, virtually all that we know or think that we know about the world beyond our immediate experience comes to us through media and technology. So I'd like to argue again for just a critical approach to digital media literacy as part of global citizenship. And I think that critical look at media and technology will give us a framework to explore issues of human rights, of climate emergency, of perspectives on education and what teachers are doing or what is reported they should and shouldn't be doing, perhaps. Another issue that I think is really important when we talk about opportunities for global citizenship and education today is paying close attention to what is often referred to as the platformization of education and the platformization of the classroom and what's happening to teaching and learning as a result. Antonio, you mentioned security and data collection and access certainly is part of that, and a critical use or critical thinking about these platforms and technology should be part of it as well. So I'll just close with that pitch again for the role of media literacy in all of this for teachers, students, but also for other partners, NGOs, organizations around the world. I'd also like to mention that in Vancouver, Canada, in March of 2023, there is a Media Education Summit to which all of you are welcome and invited. I invite you to check that out online and see if it's something you might be interested in. I know that these are questions that we'll be addressing there, issues around citizenship, our climate, and human rights today. Thank you.
Thank you, Caroline. And Antonia, 1 minute. Just 1 minute, I'm sorry, because time is eating us up.
Difficult. So Esther got me thinking that maybe part of the response to your question, Lisa, is about teacher collaboration and teachers coming together, really consciously fighting that notion of the individual teacher as some sort of a superhero and recognizing that it does take a whole school. And I think one of the powers of the digital is, of course, that we can more easily connect across borders as well. So teachers can find like-minded colleagues and hopefully support each other as we go about the work. There is also something about accountability, and I think going back to Shalma's comment about sexuality, comprehensive sexuality education, for instance, I think the global level has a massive role to play in just holding governments to account, shining a spotlight on those that are up to no good. And I think accountability comes in also when we look at all the different people that we want to have involved as we strive for quality global citizenship education for all, just knowing that not all come with the same contributions, the same ambitions, and that it's important that there are accountability mechanisms built in as well.
Thank you so much, Antonia, and thank you to all our speakers. We had a wonderful session. We are coming to the close of this time together, and I would like to remind you all that education, our schools, should elevate our students to be highly capable, but at the same time, profoundly human. And I believe that that is the core of global citizenship education. We have now a 60-minute break, and then we will come back to finalize our day with the last sessions of these days and also of the conference. Thank you so much to everyone.